button. Well, definitely, yeah, I appreciate your time today, man. I've watched you for a while. Actually, I did a little bit of homework because I swore that I remembered seeing you for the first time at the UFC 202 press conference where the water bottles were being thrown. And I was like, maybe that was Brett or somebody else I'm thinking of because you guys, somebody who had a deep voice, I remember at that one. But then I looked up the one I was thinking of, which was I think UFC in Dallas. I want to say
Yes, I was
for
at the Dallas one. I was not at the water bottle throwing one.
I remember seeing that live and people commenting on it like they were surprised to see that happen. I'm like, really, with the Diaz brothers and with Connor,
Yeah.
it was really when I first heavily started paying attention to the UFC and MMA was around that time, like 2015. I had watched it for years, but I definitely have seen your page, which by the way, love the show, seen it grow over the years, man. And I love the work that you do. And in trying to get together on this podcast for the last couple of weeks, a lot of news has been coming out. And, first off, I have to say, I just read the news almost 2 hours ago before we did this about Mark Coleman is responding. I, God, I'm so happy to hear that. Oh, an absolute stud of the game. If people don't know who he is, I mean, you like the guy. One of his friends was quoted saying, "You can't make a movie out of this because nobody would believe." It's just
Mm.
his story's incredible, getting through to sobriety, and also lesser known fact, but this is the it would have been the 40th birthday on March 6th of one Anthony Rumble Johnson. So
Mm.
got to give a drop a couple things here, but yes, absolutely. Thank you for your time today. And I wanted to first jump into the news, obviously, with the influencer that should not be named in the combat community going to be taking on Mike Tyson this summer in July. And that's, I mean, the news didn't really surprise me to see that he's fighting Mike Tyson. I guess I'm like a lot of other people. I don't know if I see the it's just an interesting move because there's not a lot of payoff for Mr. Paul in that fight against and people they love Mike Tyson regardless of whether he wins or loses this fight. Being honest, I mean Mike, it doesn't seem like anybody dislikes him. Even the people in the past that did, they like him now. What are your thoughts on not just this fight, but the whole influencer thing?
I mean, I will tell you, I feel a little bit differently, I guess, than I don't know if it's most MMA fans, but some of the prevailing narratives I hear about this. Look, do I really care to see Jake Paul box Mike Tyson as a fight that strictly on fight terms that I care about? No, of course not. Like, I don't care about it at all. And I'm one of the few people that's been to many Jake Paul fights as a consequence of working with Showtime. I was at the first and second Woodley fight. I was at the Anderson Silva fight. I was at his brother's, it was a boxing match, obviously, but his brother's match with Floyd Mayweather. Like, I've seen a lot of this stuff really up close in ways that I think a lot of MMA fans haven't necessarily. And so I'm somewhat numb to it as a consequence, but like I don't care about the fight on those terms at all. It does nothing for me. It does nothing for boxing in the sense of showing you the best that the game has to offer or anything like that. But I feel like people are kind of missing a little bit of the story that actually does matter here. Number one, I really don't think folks understand how big Netflix is. Okay, let's back up a step here. ESPN Plus, which airs all of the UFC pay-per-views, has 25 million subscribers. Okay. Netflix has 10 more than 10 times that amount. 260 million and counting. It is far and away the biggest streaming platform anywhere on earth. It is well known that there have been shows that have aired on places like HBO Max and they were not very popular, and then they got sold to, or Netflix bought the rights to air some of these episodes of these shows, and then all of a sudden the show turns into a hit because there's just not nearly the same amount of audience, and also so it's more than that. Like Netflix has a certain kind of cultural cachet that other streaming platforms don't have. So to get Netflix into the combat sports business is a big deal. And then to get them into the live event combat sports business, that is enormous. Now, maybe they're just one and done here, in which case there really is no story beyond it, but I tend to think it won't be. I tend to think that there will be a little bit more to be had there. Getting them into the, I mean, I rarely use this term, but getting them into the combat sports is a game changer, flat out game changer. It's an enormous thing to have them in there. Granted, it's for a fight that we don't really care about, but just to get them into that world, I think is a big deal. And secondly, you know, your appetite, my appetite, anyone's appetite for example, we have Nate Diaz who's going to rematch Jorge Masvidal. It'll be in boxing. I think it'll be June 1st. Is what they announced. You know, again, your mileage may vary about how much you like that, but like, just ask yourself a question. And I'm not giving Jake Paul all the credit. That's not what I'm saying. It's a larger phenomenon of which he is one part. But were it not for that phenomenon, and in particular the kind of way in which Jake Paul has gotten MMA fans to watch MMA fighters box, again, not the only guy, but a big part of it, you know, are those two really going to rematch outside of the UFC in boxing, but for some of these forces? I don't think that they would. And again, I'm not saying that I want to see that necessarily, but the point I'm trying to make is that's where they're going to get the big money that they're not getting as a consequence of their MMA career. So to me, it's like everyone's grumbling about Jake Paul fighting Mike Tyson, who's nearly 60 years old. Yeah, the fight's stupid. It's stupid. It's quite obviously stupid, right? It's not for educated combat sports fans. That's not the audience at all. But I tell you what, this whole thing has been getting some MMA fighters paid, and if Netflix is actually going to get into the combat sports business, boys, that is a monster story.
And that's one thing that people I don't think give enough credit to Connor for is, you know, he was kind of, I think he was smart in knowing what something is going to be like the visual because, you know, getting in there and facing off with Peter Yan and Mike Perry, it's, you know, KSI. I don't know if they had a face to face, but just, you know, to get his name out there, that's kind of the model. I think as much crap as Jake Paul and Conor McGregor have talked to each other, I think Jake Paul, his business model has used some of Conor's, the path that he has been on. But I agree with you that this is just, I mean, the amount of eyeballs that are going to be on this is truly mind blowing. And I like to see it. I mean, as far as the, you know, the MMA fighters getting paid, because some of these things, I mean, you just like, I couldn't bear to watch Tito and Chuck 2 when that happened, but you know, you're such a fan of them that you're happy they're getting that big payday. Which league do you think, you know, a fighting league, I should say, in the next decade is? Because I mean, now you've got Game Bread FC, you know, you've got the PFL taking off. Do you think that these people, I should say, are going to ever reach UFC level, or will they always be number two?
I am of the belief that I don't. Okay, so some of them will survive. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here suggesting that any organization not named UFC is going out of business. That's not what I mean. But I don't think folks really quite, from my view, this is just my view, I don't think folks really understand the ball game here a little bit. It is not possible to compete with the UFC. Literally not possible. It is not even approachable. I've been talking to labor economists for some stuff I'm working on because, as you know, there's a antitrust trial that'll start the Monday after UFC 300. It's already on the books. It is set in court to begin April 15th in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so I've been talking to some labor economists who have been familiar with the lawsuit, and I've been asking them, like, how strong is the evidence against them, like, based on your understanding of some of these claims and this world. And like, I mean, dude, every single one of them has been like, it's a slam dunk. I mean, it's an obvious case. Like, what they have told me is, like, it's not a question about whether UFC is a monopoly. The question is merely relative to other ones they've seen, how bad is it? And their answer is that it's like, you could cut a third of the UFC's market share away and it would still be a monopoly. Like, that's how much they control. And so people are like, hey, is Gamebird FC going to make it? They've got an interesting kind of bare knuckle thing going. It is a It is a real alternative in that sense, right? The gloves do change a lot, especially in the grappling and things like that. And then PFL is heavily capitalized with venture capital. They have a lot of that money coming in, but the score is what the score is, namely, unless there is federal legislation that changes the industry, which is at this stage unlikely. The guy who was the previous sort of shepherd of this bill in Congress is a Republican by the name of Mark Wayne Mullen out of Oklahoma. He was a congressman, now he's a senator,
Right.
and he's a former MMA fighter, and then he turned legislator. But while he was a congressman, he was helping to push through the Ali Act to MMA. Now that he is a senator, he hasn't even bothered to take it back up again. I don't know why, but that's just where we are. So then the only thing that could reasonably make the industry more competitive is some kind of favorable outcome in an antitrust trial. This one won't get us there. There's actually another one that's going to be behind this one, or another case. We'll see if it goes to trial. It's sort of a different thing, but there's another. It's the same. It's the same claim. It's just for two different time periods. So unless the second of those changes the industry, anybody who tries to actually compete with the UFC is going to go out of business. Fact. They will not make it. They will not last. I mean, dude, we just came off the heels of that PFL Bellator show. Now, granted, it was in Saudi Arabia. I don't know how much there's an actual organic market there, rather than, hey, this is a very well-capitalized area that's just bringing entertainment there. I don't know the answer to that. But they didn't have anybody hardly there. And you could take that show, forget Ireland or Paris. Obviously, those are like rabid fan bases. But here in the United States, what city are you going to go to and sell out 10,000 people? It doesn't exist. They don't have a fan base here. And they've been around how long, and they have how much money? It's not possible. It's not possible. The amount of size and control that the UFC has makes it absolutely no way you can make that work. So let's see what happens in these other forces. But if nothing changes it, yeah, the PFL's days are numbered.
And it raises an interesting point too, because I wonder how long somebody like Dana White has been in the business. It's so much of this has kept him up at night. I can't imagine how many nights. Who do you think is somebody who could step into that position and be successful? A lot of people have mentioned DC is one of the names. I don't think that'll happen if I had to guess, but your best guess.
I'm not sure. I mean, it's going to sound like I'm being heavily insulting, and I am a little bit, but not really. I mean, listen, if you watch MMA enough, or especially if you watch boxing enough, you don't come away from any of these fights being like, man, these promoters, these are just, these guys are Boy Scouts. They're just the most honest people. Like, dude, I mean, and these are good promoters too. Dude, think about Bob Arum, right? This fucking guy, Bob Arum, is like, what, 90 or something? I mean, he's I forget how old he is. He's like late 80s or so. Like, this guy literally, people don't understand this. He went to Harvard and he promoted Muhammad Ali in the 60s. Dude, it's 2024 and he's still staging super relevant boxing. It's just fucking crazy. So he's not a dummy. He's not a dummy at all. He's not a dummy. But would you say that Bob Arum is like the most ethical and always tells the truth, and whatever else you want to say about somebody who like a high upstanding character? That's just, dude, you can't do that job effectively trying to be a Boy Scout. It doesn't work. So what you're trying to do is you want to find someone smart, someone who's a real fight fan, someone who's got the gift of gab, and someone who doesn't mind stretching the truth. That's just that you can't. Again, if I wanted to be a promoter, I couldn't be successful unless I was willing to do those things. You got to find someone who can play with that. And I love the guy I'm about to say because I've had a long-standing relationship with him, and I don't think he'd mind me saying this, to be perfectly honest with him. Dude, Chael might be one of those guys. Chael can play some of these levels in a way where he can enthusiastically sell something. He understands. You can't say he's not a fight fan, because he is. He will stretch the truth as he needs to. And, he's got longevity in the fight game. Those are some characteristics, I think, that you could build around. DC, I think, has got some of that too, but maybe a little bit differently. But honestly, I get asked this question actually a fair amount. And I actually don't think that there is a clear successor to Dana White. I don't think that you can find, it's that guy. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know who would be that thing. And I think the fact that like Bob Arum has been around for as long as he is partly a testament to him and his ability. But it's the same problem. If you went to top rank offices and you said, who's going to replace this guy? Maybe they have an answer now because he's old. But I bet for the like 20 years ago when he was in the 60s and 70s, they did not have an answer for that. And it's because it's hard. It's actually quite difficult to replace them.
Very ironic that the first time I ever heard Bob Arum's name, it was actually Dana White in some interview, just trashing him over something. And but you got to give him credit. Yeah, I mean to go from Ali's prime to 2024 primes, you're still doing it. It is just remarkable. But now to watch all of these different side leagues happening, it's interesting to watch, fighters getting into this position of where they're like what George Masvidal is doing. And, even I have to give some credit to, like a Jake Paul, at least he has some sort of business mind model, but it's going to be interesting to see the ones who kind of bend like that, who just don't mind throwing away, hey, we're going to stretch the truth a little bit, not even think anything of it. But I don't know. I mean, somebody like Francis, too, that's why it's so fascinating to me to see where he is now. And it's such a short period of time. That fight, though, I mean, it was tough to watch. As much as I wanted him to beat AJ, I figured it would go something like that. What is next for a guy like Francis Ngannou after that night that he just went through?
I mean, okay, so based on what he said for himself, he's definitely not retiring from combat sports. He didn't quite explicitly say it this way, but it sounded like he said he wasn't done in boxing, and I think that there might be some truth to that in the sense that listen, if there's another big name opponent and the Saudis or anybody else, I suppose, wants to write him a big check, I suspect he would probably take that fight. I suspect he thinks that, not that he probably looks at what happened against AJ as a fluke, but that he could correct for it the next time. Most fighters tend to feel that way. They tend to feel like mistakes are easily correctable or bad outcomes are, they very much feel like the world's forces are within their control. They have control over these things, and so that they see failure as a lack of their ability in that moment to faithfully execute the control that they actually do have. So there's that. I don't know if that's going to be his reality, though. I don't know what kind of money or interest is going to be. That was a really, really bad loss. I mean, it's not just that it happened in the second round. Good fighters have lost in the second round. Hagler Hearns didn't go the distance. I mean, I'm not comparing Francis to that. I'm simply saying, this idea that I think Hearns beat Duran in what, like the second or third round, like something crazy.
Right.
So like good fight. Yeah, exactly. Good fighters do lose early, but this was. He got dropped in the first, he got dropped in the second, and then he got polished off. And it just looked like he was taken to school out there. And then he had the vicious KO on top of it. And like, it's not just all that too. Remember, there was this, I don't know if it was a myth, but we kind of thought that Francis's chin was really good. He had taken some big punches before and kind of ate them. And here he took punches from Anthony Joshua, and he looked like he had never been hit that way ever in his life. And this is a guy who came from a sport where you can be hit with knees and head kicks. It's kind of a wake up. Like, I mean, Anthony Joshua must have some significant power. So my view is that I do think before the Joshua fight, I was like, oh, he's never going to fight MMA. And now I think, based on what happened there, I think he probably will go to PFL and probably fight Renan Ferreira. How much you're supposed to care about that fight, I leave up to everybody else. But I think the likelihood of that has grown significantly. I mean, what I will say is, if that goes poorly, because, Ferreira is not great, but he's a big dude. He's like, what is he, 6'7", 6'8"? He's a large guy.
Oh, yeah.
That guy he's got huge power. Bad things can happen. Ask Ryan Bader. So if something bad were to happen there, that might spell the end of his career. But if he can use that as like a launch point to like, not erase what happened to Anthony Joshua, but, put it behind him, so to speak, I think that would breathe some new life into his career. But I guess we'll have to see.
It was tough. I mean, I was driving when that fight was happening, and the the stream I had on was Michael Bisping's page, which I love his page. He has a show he does sometimes with his wife. They're hilarious, but it was as I was driving, listening to it, hearing him get knocked down over and over. I just kept thinking of George Foreman and Joe Frazier. That kind of beatdown, and you're as powerful a name and a presence as he is. I mean, that's huge on the ego and what it does to the public perception. Do you think, in terms of where he stacks up against John Jones, because I think that's still going to be talked about even after this loss for Ngannou. That fight is just, the two baddest men on the planet still, if you think about it, because Ngannou lost a boxing match. He didn't lose an MMA match. Do you think the public now is like, oh, 100% John Jones will win this? Or do you think they'll go, oh, no, I think still, Ngannou has the more crisp boxing?
I I mean, I definitely already saw, to the extent that social media is a reflection of reality, which, be very careful with that. But I
Yeah,
definitely did see some people going out there saying, "Oh, John would have killed him," and I'm like, guys, I'm not saying that's not true. I'm not saying that John wouldn't beat him. I mean, again, part of the allure of that fight is we don't know. Like, it'd be really fun to see, right? So,
definitely.
John could beat him. I'm not in any way denying that that's not possible. But like, Anthony Joshua flatlining Francis in boxing doesn't tell you anything about what John Jones would do. Nothing. Like, he doesn't have that size. He doesn't have, in terms of the heft, he doesn't have that size. He doesn't have that power. In terms of the boxing, he does not have that skill. Not at all. He's older than Anthony Joshua. Like, no, just not. It's not. It doesn't. It doesn't tell you much. However, the point that I would say is, I think that I think that Ngannou is fine in the sense of, I think after a loss like that, you should probably rest your brain a little bit. But the thing that I would really go back to beyond that is to what extent that is psychologically scarring. So, for example, granted, this was when he was much more of a junior level fighter, but after the first Ngannou and Stipe Miocic fight, where Francis just got housed basically for 5 rounds, you'll recall his rematch was against Derek Lewis in one of the worst fights in UFC, not just heavyweight history, just UFC history. Just a
Awful.
terrible, terrible, yeah, awful fight. Like, the one of the worst ones I've ever seen. He was clearly not himself, right?
Mm-mm.
Clearly not himself. Dude, he was psychologically affected by that. I mean, I think he really was. Like, and I go back to it. One of the thing, the first time in MMA, obviously you've seen it in boxing, but the first time I ever saw someone get changed by a fight was when David Loiseau fought Rich Franklin.
Oh,
And
yeah.
remember that? So the fight just goes on and on and on and on, and Loiseau can't get going. He can't get this guy off of him. He can't do anything, like nothing. And the beating just continues and continues and continues. Dude, he was never the same after that. He was never the same. So I guess the question I have for Francis is, what kind of psychological response is he going to have to this? What kind of fortitude is he going to be able to show? We have seen him react negatively to a bad loss before, but of course, the long story is he actually got better in the end. But there was a hiccup. I mean, there's no denying there was a hiccup. I will be very curious to see if there's a hiccup following this one. That was a very bad loss.
I definitely remember watching Lewis and Ngannou fight because that was my birthday, the Habib Connor card when that happened, October 6th, 2018. But everybody forgets because of the melee, obviously, with Habib after that fight, that was just, I remember that being talked about as like one of the worst fights of all time, up there with Rose and was Carla. I mean, it was just, but
Yeah.
it's, now in the era of these super fights, it's going to be interesting to see if any of these fighters can, or is there too much money being pumped in, you think, to do super cards where there's something like Ngannou headlines over, like, I'm trying to think of a comparable athlete, but somebody like, if Connor did a card and like a Jake was on there, Connor and KSI wonder if we're going to get to that level. And it's just, I don't know, is it really worth it to have these super fights as much as we have been? Because I just maybe I'm too much of a purist, but I'm not super into it. But do you ever think that like Ngannou and Jake Paul, I think that's more realistic than Connor and Jake fighting different
Oh,
people
no,
on
no,
those
no. I
cards?
disagree completely. I think Connor and Jake is almost inevitable. Almost inevitable.
Oh yeah, no,
Um,
no, I agree. Like if they like say if Connor fought somebody different and Jake was fighting someone different on that same card, do you ever think we'll get to that level where two superstars can be stacked up
oh,
like that?
so, I mean, well, first of all, just I want to be clear about this. I think that Conor McGregor is absolutely going to try and fight Jake Paul once he gets out of his UFC deal. Like, there's no doubt in my mind.
Agreed.
And that's the other part. That's the other part too. It's like, dude, like people are like, what does Jake get out of beating Tyson? Well, beating Tyson himself at 58 by the time they fight, nothing. Like, there's no, you don't get anything from that in terms of like bragging rights or something. But if that's a huge financial success for everybody and another opponent realizes, ooh, I can get big money fighting Jake Paul because his stature is growing as a money and big event generator, dude, they will line up to fight him. Like, matter of factly, they will line up to fight him. So like that, you have to understand that perspective. In terms of stacking cards in that way, I mean, that's really hard to say. It's a good question because it is very hard to say. The only thing that we have to really go on presently is like, the Saudis have transformed heavyweight boxing, at least right now, right? Like, so they've got these cards where they're having like a bunch of the Fury Ngannou card had like a bunch of stuff on it, and even this one they had the Joseph Parker and Big Bang Zhang, which is for boxing hardcores, that's a really relevant and important fight, and they have other ones down the list. Like, they're able to just move mountains very quickly by obviously the money that they can offer, and so in that sense you would want to not discount what they're capable of doing. But I also grant like the premise of the question, which is that's still very difficult to do. That's also just the heavyweight division. We haven't even talked about any of the lighter guys, which they have not yet moved any mountains on. So what I would say is I'll believe it when I see it, but I would not discount the capacity of an entity like Saudi Arabia to potentially transform combat sports in that way, you know?
Yeah, it's. I remember hearing somewhere that there was Tyson Fury was going to fight. I want to say Klitschko, but someone on a cruise ship. That was just when I was like, okay, this is Saudi money is absolutely another beast. But watching the way that UFC's the big card this year that everybody's talking about, UFC 300, the way it played out, I don't like how it takes away from some of these fights because Alex and Jamal, I mean, that's for people who know anything about it, but do you think it's going to come to a point where it's just these people are not even thinking about the best matchups all the time? They're thinking about, or at least half the time, they're thinking about the money because, like you and I would love to watch a fight like Alex Pereira and Jamal Hill, but a lot of people too are going to be scratching their heads like, I've heard of Alex, but I don't know this other guy, or they don't know both of them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, okay, so like you got to understand a couple of things. One is that the largest, by far, like not even close, like not even debatable, the largest audience of combat sports fans is casuals by a million miles. Like, that is where the money is. The money is not in you or me. They've got us no
Right.
matter what, and there's not that many of us. I mean, there's enough to like make a little bit of money, but that's not the big money. The big money is when you reach everybody else, when your grandmother calls you or your coworker texts you or your friend calls you and says, "Hey, did you hear about this fight?" or blah blah blah. Like, that's when that's the money. The money is when you hit that part. So there's always going to be competing interests about trying to make sure that you do satisfy. Because if you lose the hardcore fight fans enough, then problems emerge. You don't have to have them for everyone. Like, Jake Paul is a living testament to that. But like for the UFC's brand reputation, you have to be very careful with that. But they are the largest audience by far, so you have to satisfy that if you really want to get the big money. But the second thing I'd say is, it's a lesson for everyone to really understand promoter motivations, which is that a promoter's job is not to put on the very best fights that everyone wants. That's really not. I mean, we want them to do that, and we like it when they do, but that's not their job. The job is to put on fights that people want to pay money to see. Period. That's the job. That's the job. no matter what. And when you change your perspective and you watch what promoters do around that kind of North Star, so to speak, everything will make just much more sense over time. It will be like, oh, right, that's why they're doing this. So again, you have to balance that with legitimacy. You can't cast legitimacy out the window. There are competing goods here. So I think 300 benefits because it's got this sort of, round number that everyone's going to generate a news cycle around. The card itself is like monstrously stacked. There's like a gazillion former world champions on there, and there's relevant fights all over. And you can nitpick. I would rather have this one here and that one. I like it a little bit more. Again, you could play a little bit of criticism with it. And to your point, the main event doesn't have the biggest stars on it that the brand has to offer. Part of that is they have too many shows and they can't fulfill obligations in that way. But in general, that's one of those shows to me that I don't think is going to be like a monster winner with casual fans, but I think it will be a hit with them, and they've already done more than enough to lock up the yous and the me's, so to speak, of the world. So I tend to think it will do quite well in the end.
And that is a good point that I think it's where you have to think about it for the money, but also with how, like, I think that lightweight at one point was the most competitive and most interesting division when you had Connor, Habib, Tony, that rotation of those guys. Now I think I guess personally, that I should say, it's the most competitive divisions I think right now are 185, I want to say, and 145, with respect still to lightweight and welterweight. But all of these big events still coming up. I mean, UFC in Mexico. Do you think that there will be? So I guess I should say, let's see how Justin. Let's say he wins. It plays out that he wins, by decision, beats Max. Do you expect him to get a rematch against, or not a rematch, get a fight against Islam, or do you think that Dustin could jump in there? Because also people don't think about how you have to have fighters available also for these cards to be able to, like, their timeline for it to work out.
I mean, it's hard to say what the UFC is going to do. And it's weird too, right? Because part of the way that the Dustin sort of title shot thing got introduced was that Ali Abdelaziz, who manages Islam, tweeted about like, "Hey, Dustin might have earned this," but he also manages Justin. So
Right.
it was like, I don't quite get what the plan is there. I mean, here's my personal belief. Like, dude, I thought that win, I did not think Dustin was going to beat BSD, and he did. And he did it spectacularly. Like all the credit in the world to him. Prove people like me wrong. It was fantastic. And he should get a big reward for that. I firmly believe that. On the other hand, I feel like what Gaethje has done since beating Fiziev and then beating Dustin, and then if he fights and defeats Max, which I don't think is as easy as people are making it out to be. People are like, oh, Max is going to take a beating. I favor Justin to win, but I still think that fight might be a little bit tougher than folks realize or are expecting. So to me, if Justin wins that either by stoppage or decision, to the point that you raised in your question, I think he should get the title shot personally. But that win for Dustin was huge, 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 huge win. And I'll say this: if Justin Gaethje goes into that fight with Max Holloway and ekes one out, whereas Dustin just blew past BSD,
right?
Anything's possible. Anything's possible at that point. But my personal preference is the resume that Justin has accumulated entitles him to a title shot should he prove victorious at 300.
I agree. I mean, Justin, it is hard to put Dustin away. I give him credit for that, especially after, the pressure was on him after them fighting once already and him going down to Dustin. But I mean, Dustin is a dog, and that was just, it sucks that Benoit had the staff, but still, you got to give credit to Dustin. I mean, that was a veteran victory. And people forget that guy, I mean, his losses are to Charles Oliveira, to Habib, I mean, and to, years ago it was Michael Johnson. But I mean, the guy has done nothing, but it's, I saw a meme the other day with him. I guess you would call, but it was something that said the only guy to finish finish Connor, and also the only guy to something with I think KO. Not, was it KO Justin? I want to say Justin lost another fight by knockout,
So no,
but
hold on. Here we go. So Dustin Poirier has done the following. He is the only guy to finish Max Holloway. He
yeah.
finished Eddie Alvarez. He finished Michael Chandler. He finished Justin Gaethje, and he finished Conor McGregor, beating him twice. I mean, that's a that's a dog. I mean, that's a tough guy. That's a very very talented guy. You know.
Top of the food chain, and it's cool because the first time I ever saw him was when he fought Connor and got to know a little bit more about Dustin, and I then realized that I was no longer a casual because I was looking into it and I was like, hey, Dustin's not a silly hillbilly. I mean, this guy is definitely well read, can go out there and just, I think he responds to pressure, doesn't get enough credit for that. I mean, better than anyone in the UFC because, yeah, you think about how he has gone from fighting Connor in that first fight to being a generation later and taking out Benoit the way this, I mean, a decorated military man, just there's no fear in Dustin. And that's, I really hope, if I had to be honest, I'm pulling for Dustin to win against Islam. We'll see how it all shakes out, man. But I know you got to be on the run. I definitely appreciate you being on. And I, once again, love your show, love the way you cover the game. And we'll do this hopefully soon again, brother.
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. And
Cool.
yeah, man, you're a real fight fan, so keep doing what you're doing, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Absolutely. Luke Thomas, appreciate you being on the post game podcast today. And we'll talk again soon, brother.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, man.
Peace.